The night before my wedding, my father walked into my room and said he wanted to teach me how to please a husband. The next morning, he smiled as he walked me down the aisle like nothing had happened. "Tell me, how do you marry the man you love when the man who gave you away has already taken everything from you? If you've ever felt invisible, stay till the end. This story is for you." My name is Evelyn Carter, and I am 80 years old. Most mornings, you can find me in my bakery at the corner of Main and Pine in the small town of Ashwood, Oregon. I open the doors before sunrise, when the air is still soft and cold, and the smell of apples fills the street before anyone is awake to notice. People say my pies taste like home. They come in on Saturdays, smiling, telling me that a single bite reminds them of their mothers, their childhoods, their Christmas mornings. I always smile back. I even laugh sometimes. But inside, I know that what they're really tasting is a secret I've been baking into every crust for 60 years, a secret that used to burn my soul until I learned how to turn it into sugar. That morning, as I sprinkled cinnamon over a tray of warm pies, I caught my reflection in the glass case. My face looked kind, maybe even peaceful, but my eyes, they still carried the same storm, the same memory that no amount of time could erase. I turned to the camera that my granddaughter had set up for me last week. She said she wanted to help me tell my story before it disappears. I thought about refusing. Then I realized maybe the story never belonged to me alone. Maybe it belongs to every woman who has ever been told to stay quiet. I looked straight into the lens and said, softly, "On my wedding night, the man who gave me away took everything from me." The words hung in the air like smoke from a candle. For a moment, the bakery went completely silent, as if the walls themselves were listening. But that night wasn't where my story began. It was where generations of silence ended. Ashwood is the kind of town that never changes. The church bell still rings every hour, and the same group of men still play checkers outside the general store, arguing about the weather as if it were a political debate. Around here, people remember faces better than names. To them, I'm Miss Evelyn, the lady who makes pies for charity events and never misses Sunday service. Sometimes I wonder if they would still smile at me if they knew what I had done or what had been done to me. They see an old woman with flour on her apron, not a girl who once stood in a white dress that didn't belong to her. A teenage girl once asked me why I never remarried after my husband passed away. I told her that one love in a lifetime was enough. What I didn't tell her was that my wedding day was also the day I lost the version of myself I was supposed to become. People assume pain fades when your hair turns gray. They don't realize some memories age with you. They learn to hide in the folds of your smile. Every time I fold a crust, I think of that night. Every time I tie my apron, I feel the knot in my chest pull tighter. I used to think silence would protect me, but silence only gave my father more power than he ever deserved. And it was the sound of his footsteps outside my bedroom door that taught me how fear can wear the face of love. I was 18 the summer I married James Miller, the kindest man I had ever met. He worked long hours driving a delivery truck and smelled faintly of pine and engine oil. When he smiled, the world seemed to forgive itself for a moment. The night before the wedding, my mother left a folded note on my vanity mirror. It said, "Be patient, be kind, be silent." I thought she meant marriage. Now I know she meant survival. That night, I sat on my bed, brushing my hair, thinking of my white dress hanging by the door. I was nervous but happy. Then I heard the creak of the hallway floorboards. The rhythm of those steps, I would know them anywhere. My father's shadow slipped through the crack of the door before I could even breathe. He said he wanted to make sure I would be a good wife. I remember the smell of whiskey, the way his hand closed around my wrist, the sound of the chair tipping over. I remember the ceiling spinning and how my voice disappeared into the dark. The next morning, I walked down the aisle, my arm looped through his, the whole town watching. The church smelled of lilies and fresh paint. My father smiled, proud and calm, while my mother stared at the floor. I smiled too, because that's what brides do. But inside, I was already gone. If you had been there, you would have seen a girl in a white dress. You wouldn't have noticed the small red stain near the hem. You wouldn't have seen the way her hands trembled when she said, "I do." That day, everyone celebrated a marriage. But it wasn't mine. It was his, the man who owned my silence. If you've ever carried a secret that burned your soul, stay with me till the end. This story is for you. Because the worst part wasn't that he broke me that night. It was that the world kept calling it love. I used to think the wedding was where the story began, but truthfully, it started long before that, inside a house that taught me what silence really costs. I was born in 1946, on a stretch of flat land outside Beatrice, Nebraska, the kind of place where wind could howl for hours without anyone hearing it. We lived on a small farm, a pale yellow house with chipped paint and windows that whistled in winter. My father, Harold Carter, owned the only grocery store in town. People said he was a man of integrity. They said he helped everyone. And he did everyone except us. My mother, Margaret, rarely spoke above a whisper. Her voice was soft, like the rustle of dry leaves. Every morning she packed my father's lunch, ironed his shirts, and waited for the sound of his boots crossing the porch. When it came, she would straighten her back, lift her chin, and smile. That smile was her armor. There were 7 of us children, but I was the one who stayed closest to her. Maybe because I was the quiet one, the one who learned early that noise could make a man's temper turn. At night, the house had its own rhythm, the tick of the kitchen clock, the low hum of the refrigerator, and the slow, patient creak of my father's wooden chair. That sound became the heartbeat of my childhood. Every time it scraped against the floor, the air changed. You could feel it before he spoke. When he was angry, he didn't shout. He didn't have to. His silence was heavier than sound. My father believed in discipline. That was his favorite word. It meant obedience, neatness, and the absence of questions. He kept a leather belt folded neatly beside his Bible, both polished and worn. If we dropped a plate, he would stand in the doorway and watch us clean it up piece by piece. No words, just that quiet stare. I learned to apologize before he even opened his mouth. One evening, my brother spilled milk on the table. My father's hand moved faster than breath. The sound of his palm meeting skin echoed across the room. No one cried out. My mother simply reached for a rag, wiped the milk, and said, "It's fine, Harold." But it wasn't fine. Nothing ever was. After that night, I started holding my breath whenever he entered a room. My ribs would ache, but I thought if I stayed small enough, maybe he wouldn't see me. Then came the day he caught me reading one of his store receipts, trying to practice my numbers. He slapped the paper from my hands. Girls don't need to think. They need to listen. I remember the taste of dust as the paper hit the floor. I picked it up and whispered, "Yes, sir." That was the first time I felt something close to hate. Not for him, but for the way my mother's eyes lowered when she heard those words. That was the night I learned silence could protect you and destroy you at the same time. My mother was gentle in the way rain is gentle before it floods. She had a small scar near her temple, a thin line that disappeared beneath her hair. I asked her once where it came from. She said she fell off a ladder, but her eyes told a different story. Sometimes, when father was late coming home, she would sing softly while washing dishes. Her voice trembled, but it made the air softer. When she noticed me listening, she'd press a finger to her lips and whisper, "Don't let him hear." I wanted to ask her why we were always whispering in our own house, but the words never came. At dinner, she served him first. Always. If he was in a good mood, he'd let us talk about school. If not, the table became a courtroom, and silence was the only way to survive. Once, my little sister asked if she could keep a stray kitten. My father didn't answer. He simply reached down, grabbed the kitten by the neck, and tossed it out the back door. My mother flinched, but she said nothing. Later that night, I found her outside, kneeling in the dark, whispering into the wind. That was the first time I saw her cry. For years I thought my mother was weak. Now I know she was enduring the kind of war that has no medals and no witnesses. If this moment touched you, share it. Someone out there might need it today. Her silence became the cage that raised me, but someday I would learn how to break it. Every house has a sound that defines it. For ours, it was that chair, the one he sat in every night with his newspaper and cigarette. The creak of its legs meant he was home, that the night belonged to him. Even after I left that farm, that sound followed me. I'd hear it in the swing of a door, in the rhythm of rain on tin roofs. One evening, I walked into the living room and saw him dozing with his cigarette still burning. I thought about taking it from his hand. I almost did, but then the chair creaked and I froze. He opened his eyes. Just for a second, our gazes met. There was no love there, only ownership. I stepped back slowly. The smell of smoke clung to my dress. Years later, that same chair ended up in my own kitchen. My mother gave it to me after he died, saying, "It's just wood, Evelyn. It can't hurt you anymore. She was wrong. Sometimes, when the bakery is quiet and the ovens hum like distant thunder, I swear I can still hear it. That soft, measured creak, the sound of control, the sound of everything I tried to escape. I close my eyes and listen until the silence turns heavy. The air smells like flour and memory. My hands tremble, but I don't stop working, because I know what's coming next. The night I met James Miller was the first time anyone ever called me brave, and the first time I dared to believe it might be true. I told myself that tomorrow would change everything. But before tomorrow came, there was a summer that still smelled of sunlight and dust. A summer that taught me what freedom could feel like before I understood what it would cost. I met James Miller on a day when the world seemed too wide for someone like me. I was 17, sorting oranges behind the counter of my father's grocery store in Beatrice, Nebraska. The store's old fan hummed in the corner, pushing warm air that smelled of sugar and grain. Then a delivery truck pulled up outside, its tires crunching against the gravel. He walked in, wearing a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his hands covered in the faint dust of the road. There was a calmness about him, a quiet confidence that made the room feel lighter. When he smiled, it reached his eyes in a way I had never seen before. He asked for my father, but while he waited, he noticed the small notebook I kept beside the register. "You draw?" he asked. I told him no, not really. But the truth was, I had been sketching a picture of the ocean from a magazine. I had never seen it, but I liked to imagine the sound. He leaned on the counter and said softly, "You should. There's nothing like seeing something that has no end." That sentence stayed with me. The idea of something that didn't end. It felt like a secret I had been waiting my whole life to hear. When he left, I could still smell the faint trace of motor oil and mint gum in the air. For the first time, I realized that freedom had a scent. That summer, freedom didn't arrive with open gates. It came in the shape of a man who didn't ask me to stay small. A few weeks later, I saw James again at the town's summer fair. I was carrying a tray of pies for the church table, my hair pinned back the way my mother liked. He spotted me from across the crowd, waved once, and walked straight toward me. No hesitation, no fear of who might be watching. He bought 2 lemonades and handed one to me without a word. We stood near the edge of the field, where the Ferris wheel turned slowly against the blue sky. He said, "You look like someone who's always listening for permission." I froze. He couldn't have known how true that was. I asked, "What if permission never comes?" He smiled and took a sip of lemonade. "Then you give it to yourself." It was the first time anyone had ever told me I was allowed to want something for myself. The band started playing a hymn, and laughter from the children carried through the wind. I looked at the Ferris wheel, at the seats rising and falling, and I imagined what the town would look like from up there. For once, the thought didn't scare me. When he left that evening, he touched the brim of his cap and said, "Maybe next summer you'll see the ocean." The Ferris wheel lights flickered behind him, blinking red and gold in the fading dusk. I watched until his truck disappeared down the dirt road. That night, lying in bed, I could still feel the echo of his words. It wasn't love yet. It was something simpler, something dangerous. Hope. I didn't know it then, but hope can be the quietest kind of rebellion. James started coming by the store every Thursday. Sometimes he brought fresh fruit from his deliveries. Sometimes he came just to ask how my week had been. He never pushed, he just showed up, steady and kind. My father liked him at first, said he was hardworking, polite, a man with manners. But he began to notice the way James looked at me, the small smiles, the quiet laughter, and soon the creak of that old wooden chair in the living room came more often, the sound that meant I had crossed a line I couldn't see. One evening, after James left, my father said, "A man like that doesn't belong here." I wanted to ask, "Then where do I belong?" But I didn't. Silence had always been the rule in our house. The next morning, I found my mother sewing by the window. The sun lit up the threads in her hands, thin and silver. She was working on a white veil, delicate and soft, embroidered with small blue flowers along the edge. She didn't say it was for me, but her eyes told me everything. When I touched the fabric, I felt something break open inside me. The lace was weightless, but it carried every dream my mother had buried. That night I held it against my cheek, breathing in the scent of her hands, soap and starch, and something faintly sweet. For the first time, I believed I might have a future that didn't begin and end in that house. But when I looked at her across the dinner table, She seemed smaller, her shoulders sinking under the quiet. Maybe she knew what freedom costs. Maybe she knew that for women like us, even happiness could draw blood. In our house, love and danger often wore the same face. Spring came early that year. The snow melted before Easter, and the air smelled of wet earth and lilacs. I had just finished sweeping the store when James walked in holding a small box. He looked nervous. He wasn't wearing his usual confidence. Instead, he looked like a man about to ask the world for permission to breathe. He said, "Evelyn, I can't keep driving without knowing where home is. I want it to be you." He opened the box. Inside was a modest ring, gold and simple, the kind of ring that looked like it belonged on a woman who worked with her hands. I said yes. The word came out before I even thought about it. For once, I didn't care if anyone heard. When my father found out, his jaw tightened. He asked what kind of man James was. James said, "The kind who'll take care of her." My father stared at him and said, "A man's worth is measured by his land." James replied, "Then I'll build mine." They shook hands, and I thought maybe, just maybe, this could work. The wedding was set for June of 1964. My mother finished the veil 2 days before the ceremony. When she handed it to me, her hands trembled. "It's not perfect," she said. "It doesn't have to be," I told her. "It just has to feel like freedom." That night, I stood in front of the mirror, holding the veil against my hair. The reflection looked unfamiliar. My face glowed with something I hadn't seen before: belief. For a fleeting second, I thought I might finally be safe. Then, from the hallway, I heard it. The soft groan of the wooden chair, the sound of him settling in for the night, the sound of everything I wanted to escape. I told myself that after the wedding, that sound would fade forever. But some ghosts don't vanish when you leave the room, they follow you to the altar. Some ghosts do not vanish when you leave the room. They learn your footsteps and wait for you in silence. The night before my wedding, the air inside our farmhouse felt heavy, as if the walls themselves knew what was coming. My mother had spent the entire day sewing the last stitches on my dress, humming softly to fill the quiet. She believed in rituals, clean sheets, a prayer by the window, and a cup of warm milk before sleep. I tried to believe too. The dress hung on the back of my door, white lace catching the glow of the oil lamp, the smell of starch and soap mixed with the faint scent of flour from the kitchen. I brushed my hair in slow strokes, counting each one like a heartbeat. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would step into a new life. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows. The house creaked in its familiar rhythm, the same rhythm I had known since childhood. Then came the sound I had feared most, the low groan of the wooden chair in the living room. It stopped. Footsteps began. Slow, measured, certain. I froze. The floorboards whispered under his weight, closer with every step. When the door opened, the lamplight flickered. My father stood there, his face calm, his shirt half unbuttoned. He smelled of whiskey and tobacco, and something colder, something like control. He looked at the dress hanging beside me. "It's a beautiful gown," he said. "Your mother did well." I didn't answer. My throat closed, my breath shallow. Then he said it. Words I still hear in the dark when the world goes quiet. "You can't be a good wife if you don't know what a man wants." The sentence fell like a verdict. The room tilted. My mind refused to understand, but my body already knew. I took a step back. He stepped forward. The lamp trembled on the nightstand, throwing shadows that made him look larger, endless. He reached out and touched the veil hanging beside me. "White," he said. "Pure. That's how it begins." My voice tried to form a word, any word, but the sound never came. The chair beside the dresser tipped over. The lamp shook. There was the smell of whiskey and iron, the sound of my own breath breaking apart. Then, silence. It happened inside that silence. When it was over, the only sound left was the slow ticking of the clock. I remember watching the flame of the lamp quiver until it went out. I don't know how long I stayed there. My hands trembled as I reached for the veil that had fallen to the floor. The lace caught on a nail, tearing slightly near the hem. In the dim light, I saw a small spot of red blooming in the fabric. It wasn't much, just a stain. But to me, it was everything, the proof that something sacred had been stolen and no one would ever believe it. I pressed the veil to my chest and sat on the edge of the bed. My body felt hollow, as if every breath came from somewhere far away. The house was quiet again, too quiet. I could hear my mother moving in the kitchen below, probably cleaning the dishes left from dinner. She had no idea. Or maybe she did. I thought about running. I even stood up, one hand on the doorknob. But where could I go? Every road I knew led back to him. Every door in that house belonged to his hands. I sat down again. The silence grew heavy. It smelled like oil and shame. The window pane fogged from my breath. I wiped it clean and looked out at the dark fields beyond the barn. The moon was rising, pale and full, watching me through the glass. It looked like an eye that refused to close. That was the night I learned that sometimes survival means standing still, even when standing still feels like dying. Morning arrived too soon. The sun spilled through the curtains, thin and cold. My mother knocked gently before entering. She said my name once, softly, as if afraid I might break. "You need to get dressed," she whispered. "The ceremony starts at 11. Her hands shook as she helped me into the dress. Neither of us spoke. When she reached for the veil, she paused at the small tear near the hem. Her eyes lingered on the stain that the lace couldn't quite hide. For a moment, I thought she would ask. Instead, she looked away and said, "You must smile today, no matter what." Downstairs, my father waited in his best suit. His tie was crooked, his face freshly shaven. He greeted the guests with that familiar charm, the kind that made people trust him instantly. When it was time to leave, he offered me his arm. "Ready, sweetheart?" I nodded. My legs moved, though they didn't feel like mine. The front door opened, and the sound of church bells drifted through the morning air. The walk to the chapel felt endless. The gravel crunched beneath our feet, each step echoing like a sentence being written. Inside the church, the pews were filled with faces I knew: neighbors, friends, people who believed my father was a man of God. The lilies near the altar filled the room with sweetness that made me want to choke. I could feel his hand gripping mine, firm and steady, guiding me down the aisle. Every eye turned toward us. The preacher smiled. The organ played softly. My father leaned close enough for me to hear his breath and whispered, "Keep your head high." So I did. I smiled at the man waiting for me at the altar, the one who had promised me a new life. He looked at me with love, with trust, with hope. He could not see the hollow behind my eyes. When the preacher asked if my father would give me away, he answered proudly, "I do." And in that moment, I understood what those words meant. He wasn't giving me away. He was keeping the power, even as he let go of my hand. The congregation clapped as I said the vows. I said them all. My lips moved, but the sound felt far away, like a voice borrowed from someone else's body. When James kissed me, the crowd cheered. My mother wept quietly in the front pew. My father smiled for the photographs. And I, standing there in white, felt the veil brush against my face, the same veil that carried the stain no one else could see. Everyone in that church believed they were witnessing a beginning. Only I knew it was an ending. Everyone in that church believed they were witnessing a beginning. Only I knew it was an ending. After the ceremony, life moved forward as if nothing had broken. People smiled, clapped, and wished us joy. The photographs showed a radiant bride, her face turned toward the man she loved. No one could see the quiet fracture behind that smile. When James carried me across the threshold of our small rented house, I told myself I could start over. I wanted to believe that love could wash away the stains that no one else could see. But every time he touched me, a part of me retreated into silence. At night, I lay beside him listening to his slow breathing. The rhythm was kind, steady, the sound of a man who trusted the world. I envied that peace. My body responded to him with gentleness, but my heart never stopped trembling. He never noticed. Or maybe he chose not to. I learned to smile at the right moments, to say I was happy when people asked. In the daylight, we looked like every other newlywed couple. I baked bread, swept the floors, and laughed at his jokes. But inside, I carried a secret that moved with every heartbeat. Weeks passed, then months. And one morning, I realized I was late. The day I found out I was pregnant, the sun was shining through the kitchen window, cutting through the steam of boiling water. I remember staring at the light as if it could erase what I already knew. I pressed my hand against my stomach and felt both wonder and dread. The idea of a child should have been joy, but for me, it was the sound of a door closing. I didn't tell James right away. For 3 days, I carried the news like a fragile glass bowl, afraid to drop it. He noticed my silence and asked if something was wrong. I smiled and said I was tired. When I finally told him, his eyes filled with light. He lifted me off the floor and spun me around. His joy was pure and easy. I tried to match it, but my smile cracked at the edges. That night, as he slept beside me, I pressed my hand to my stomach again. Beneath my palm, life stirred quietly. A heartbeat within a heartbeat. But whose? The question echoed inside me until it became a rhythm of its own. I told myself it didn't matter who the father was, as long as I could love the child enough for both of them. When Grace was born, the midwife said she had her mother's eyes. Everyone agreed. No one mentioned the shape of her mouth or the faint curl of her hair. James cried when he held her for the first time. He whispered her name as if it were a prayer. Grace. He said she was his greatest blessing, the proof that life could be good again after so much struggle. I nodded and kissed his cheek. I wanted to believe him. We didn't have much money, but James built a cradle by hand from leftover pine boards. He sanded each corner until it was smooth as glass. When he finished, he set it by the window and said, "Now she'll always sleep where the morning light can find her." I painted small flowers along the edges, white daisies like the ones that grew behind our house. When I leaned over that cradle and looked at her sleeping face, I felt something break and heal at the same time. The cradle became my sanctuary. It was a safe place to put her, to rock her, to whisper songs my mother used to sing. But it was also my prison. Each creak of its wood reminded me of the sound of my father's chair, the same rhythm, the same shadow. At night, when James was asleep, I would sit beside it and write in my journal. The words were never perfect, but they were honest. I looked at her, and for the first time, I saw love stronger than blood. That line became my prayer. I believed love could rewrite the truth, but the past has a way of reading between every line you try to hide. Years passed in the kind of peace that feels temporary, like a calm sea before the storm. James worked long hours at the lumber yard. Grace grew fast, her laughter echoing through the house like music I didn't deserve. From the outside, we were a happy family. We went to church on Sundays, we had dinners with friends. James would tell stories about his roots on the road, and Grace would climb onto his lap and pretend to steer an invisible truck. But sometimes, when she turned her head just right, I would see a flicker of something familiar in her expression. A tilt of the chin, a way her brow furrowed when she was angry. I would freeze, breath caught in my throat, then she would smile, and it would vanish. The fear never left completely. It lived under the surface, like a heartbeat I couldn't silence. I prayed every night that no one would ever look too closely. One evening, while folding laundry, I found a small piece of the veil tucked inside the bottom drawer. I don't remember putting it there. The fabric was yellowed now, fragile to the touch. The stain had faded, but I could still see where it had been. I held it up to the light and thought about how time can blur everything except the truth. Then, I folded it back and placed it beside Grace's first blanket. 2 generations of innocence, one built on silence, the other on hope. If anyone had asked, I would have said I was happy. But happiness built on secrets is a fragile thing. One evening, James came home early. I was rocking Grace in her cradle when he walked in and said, "You're a good mother, Evelyn." His voice was soft, filled with pride. I smiled, but inside, I felt the words sink like stones. Because being a good mother meant protecting Grace from the truth, even if it meant losing myself again. I didn't know it then, but silence, once chosen, becomes its own kind of inheritance. Silence, once chosen, becomes its own kind of inheritance. I had lived inside it for years, raising Grace in a world carefully built on half-truths and soft smiles. I thought the past was buried deep enough that it could no longer find me. But one afternoon, it knocked on my door. It was late spring, the kind of day when sunlight feels too gentle to hide any shadows. James was at work, and Grace was outside chasing butterflies across the yard. I was kneading bread dough, my hands white with flour, when I heard the sound of tires on gravel. At first, I didn't think much of it. Then came the voice, "Evelyn." It was his voice. My father's. The name scraped through the air like sandpaper. I froze. The dough slipped from my hands, falling limp against the counter. I hadn't heard that voice in years, but it carried the same weight, the same unspoken command. I turned slowly toward the doorway. He was standing there, framed by the sunlight. His hair had gone gray, his face lined, but his eyes hadn't changed. They still held that cruel calm, as if the world itself was something he owned. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Outside, Grace laughed, a sound so light it hurt to hear. He smiled. "I heard you had a child." I didn't answer. My throat felt dry, my body locked between the instinct to run and the need to protect what was mine. "I came to see my granddaughter," he said softly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The word granddaughter twisted something inside me. I stepped closer, my voice low and sharp. "She's not your granddaughter." His eyes flickered. A small smile appeared, the kind that always meant danger. "So it's true then." He stepped into the kitchen without asking, the smell of whiskey following him like a second shadow. He looked around, taking in the simple walls, the photographs on the shelf, the soft signs of a life he had never given me permission to build. "You have done well for yourself," he said. "Your husband must be proud. Does he know?" The room spun for a moment. I wanted to scream, to push him out, but the words tangled inside me. My fingers gripped the edge of the counter until the wood dug into my palms. "What do you want?" I asked. He looked at the framed picture of Grace on the table, her small face smiling back at him. "To meet her," he said. "And maybe, if the truth is mine to tell, to remind you where you came from." He reached toward the picture, but I moved faster, snatching it away. "You will never come near her," I said. The smile faded. "You think you can erase me?" he whispered. "You think you can hide the truth forever?" His words fell like stones into the silence. Then, in that same calm voice that had ruled my childhood, he said, "I could tell your husband. I could tell the whole town. Do you think they'd still see you as a good wife then?" The room was so quiet, I could hear the sound of my own pulse. "If you ever come back here," I said, "I'll make sure no one ever finds you." He looked almost amused. "You wouldn't dare." Then he left. The door closed softly behind him, and the sound of it broke something inside me that had been holding together for too long. For years, I had been running from the past. That day, it found my address. When James came home that evening, I was still sitting at the kitchen table. The bread had burned in the oven. The air smelled of smoke and fear. He touched my shoulder. "Evelyn, what happened?" I looked at him and saw the man who had given me safety without ever knowing why I needed it. I wanted to tell him everything, but the words felt dangerous, like fire in my mouth. "I think we need to move," I said finally. He frowned. "Move? Why?" "Because sometimes staying means losing more than leaving ever will." He didn't understand, not then. But he trusted me. He always had. Within a week, we packed what little we had and left the town behind. I told him I needed a fresh start, that the memories here were too heavy. He didn't ask again. The night before we left, I stood in Grace's room. The wooden cradle was too small for her now, but I ran my hand along its edge one last time. It still creaked softly under my touch, a reminder of all the nights I had sat beside it, praying for a peace I couldn't name. Outside, the wind pressed against the house, the same way it had the night before my wedding. But this time, I didn't flinch. When morning came, we loaded the truck. Grace climbed into the back seat with her doll, her hair tied with a blue ribbon. James kissed my forehead and started the engine. As we pulled away, sunlight poured through the curtains of the empty house, lighting up the dust in the air. For a moment, it looked like the walls were breathing. Then we turned onto the road, and the house disappeared behind the bend. The sound of gravel beneath the tires was steady and final. The drive to Denver felt endless. The farther we went, the more I felt the weight of that house lift from my chest. The land opened wide around us, fields, rivers, distant mountains, rising like promises I wasn't sure I could believe in. Grace slept most of the way, her small head resting against the window. James reached across the seat and took my hand. "It's going to be better," he said. I nodded. I wanted to believe him. But even as the miles stretched between me and the place I came from, I could still hear my father's voice. It sat in the back of my mind, whispering like wind through a cracked door. "You think you can hide the truth forever." As the city lights appeared on the horizon, I looked back at the road behind us. The past was still there, following at its own pace, quiet but steady. We found a small house on the outskirts of Denver, a place with peeling paint and a yard big enough for Grace to run in. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. That night, after Grace fell asleep, I stepped outside. The air smelled of pine and rain. I watched the mountains in the distance, their outlines faint in the moonlight. For the first time in years, I breathed deeply without flinching. Maybe this was what starting over felt like, not the absence of fear, but the courage to live beside it. If you've ever had to start over from nothing, share your story below. You never know who might need to hear it. I thought the past was behind me when we reached Denver. I was wrong. Some shadows travel farther than you ever imagine. I thought the past was behind me when we reached Denver. I was wrong. But in those first few months, something inside me softened for the first time in years. Maybe it was the air, lighter and sharper than the air in Nebraska. Maybe it was the mountains rising in the distance, reminding me that even the earth carries its scars beautifully. Or maybe it was simply because, for the first time, I was allowed to breathe. We found a small yellow house near the edge of town, surrounded by apple trees. James worked long days at a nearby lumber mill, and I spent my time caring for Grace. Every morning, the sun would pour through the kitchen window, catching in the curls of her hair. She was 3 by then, full of laughter and stubborn joy. Sometimes I would just watch her play and think, this is what salvation must look like. Still, there were nights when the wind outside carried the same rhythm as my father's footsteps. Those were the nights I would hold Grace a little tighter. When James suggested I open a bakery, I laughed. Who would buy my pies? I asked. He grinned. Anyone who's ever smelled one. He built the shelves himself from leftover wood at the mill, smoothing each plank until it shone. Grace helped me paint the front sign, her tiny hand smudging the blue letters until they looked like clouds. We called it Grace's Pies, though it was more than a name. It was a prayer. The bakery sat on the corner of a quiet street, just big enough for 3 tables and an oven that hummed like an old friend. On opening day, the scent of cinnamon and butter filled the air. The first customers were neighbors, then strangers, then families who began to call it the little shop that smells like home. Every pie I baked carried a piece of my story, though no one knew it. The smell of baked apples and cinnamon became my sanctuary, my symbol of peace. It reminded me that even things once bruised could be turned into something sweet. Sometimes, when I caught a whiff of that scent in the late afternoon, I'd close my eyes and imagine it filling every corner of my old life, smothering the darkness that had once lived there. James said my pies made people happy. He was wrong. They made me whole. Peace, I learned, doesn't always arrive like a gift. Sometimes it grows slowly from the hands that once trembled. Life found its rhythm. In the afternoons, the bakery would glow with golden light. James would come home early sometimes, his hands still smelling of pine, and lift Grace into the air until she squealed. I would watch them from behind the counter, my heart swelling with a quiet ache I didn't have words for. There was one evening I remember more clearly than most. Grace was learning to walk without holding anyone's hand. James stood a few feet away from her, arms open, his face soft with pride. "You can do it, sweetheart," he said. She took one step, then another. The smell of apple pies baking filled the air. The setting sun slipped through the front windows, turning the flour dust in the air into tiny golden sparks. When she finally reached him, he scooped her up and laughed a deep, genuine laugh that shook the walls. I wanted to freeze that moment forever. The sound of his laughter, the smell of cinnamon, the way the world seemed kind, just for once. That night, after Grace was asleep, James found me sitting in the dark bakery. "You still look for him, don't you?" he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He knelt beside me, took my hands, and said quietly, "Whatever he took from you, he doesn't own what you've built. You hear me?" For the first time in years, I let myself believe it might be true. But peace is fragile. Even in its warmth, I still found myself listening for engines on the road outside. The years began to soften, one by one. Grace started school. The bakery grew busier. We hired a part-time helper, and the shelves were never empty. People called me Miss Evelyn, never guessing that I had once been someone else entirely. But the fear never vanished completely. Each time a truck slowed near the bakery, my pulse quickened. Each time an unfamiliar man lingered too long near the window, my hands trembled. It was as if the past was always one turn of the road away. Then, one morning, as I was setting pies to cool on the rack, the postman walked in with a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, my mother's. I hadn't heard from her in almost 10 years. My fingers shook as I tore it open. The letter was short, only a few lines. "Your father is gone. Heart failure," they said. "He died without repentance, but maybe you can live without fear." I read it 3 times before the words began to sink in. I sat down on the flour-dusted floor, the smell of baked apples filling the air. He was gone. The man who had haunted every shadow of my life was no longer alive, and yet I didn't feel free. I felt hollow, like a door had opened inside me and nothing stood on the other side. James found me there, the letter in my lap, my apron streaked with flour and tears. He didn't ask what it said. He just sat beside me until the oven timer rang. I stood, wiped my eyes, and opened the oven door. The smell of warm cinnamon filled the room again, curling around us like a gentle reminder. For the first time in years, I breathed deeply and didn't look over my shoulder. If you've ever had to start over from nothing, share your story below. You never know who might need to hear it. My father's death didn't end my story. It only gave me permission to begin telling it out loud. My father's death didn't end my story. It only gave me permission to begin telling it out loud. For a while, peace finally felt real. The bakery thrived. Grace grew into a woman filled with the kind of light I thought had died with me. She was strong, educated, and kind in ways that made me believe the cycle had been broken. She left Denver for nursing school in California, chasing the dream of helping others heal. I stayed behind, content with my little shop, the smell of cinnamon, and letters from my daughter that arrived every few weeks. Then, in the summer of 1991, everything I thought I had survived came back to life. It was a quiet afternoon when the phone rang. The sound was ordinary, but something about it felt sharp. I wiped my hands on my apron and answered. "Mom?" Grace's voice trembled, thin and fragile like the edge of glass. I smiled instinctively. "Sweetheart, is everything all right?" There was a long pause. I could hear the sound of her breath, uneven, unsteady. "Mom," she said softly, "I'm pregnant." My heart stopped for a moment. Then it flooded with warmth. "Oh, Grace," I whispered. "That's wonderful." But she didn't respond. The silence stretched, heavy, unnatural. "Mom," she said again, her voice cracking now. "It's him." I frowned. "Who?" Another pause. Then, like the sound of a door slamming in my chest, she said the name I thought I would never hear again. Harold Carter. The room tilted. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. The air disappeared from my lungs. "Grace," I said slowly. "That's not possible. He's dead." She sobbed quietly. "He's not. He found me." The sound that came from my mouth wasn't human. It was the sound of every buried scream I had ever swallowed, rising at once. I flew to California the next morning. When Grace opened the door, she looked like the child she used to be, frightened, lost, and trying to make sense of something too big for words. She told me everything in fragments. How she met an older man while volunteering at a local clinic. How he said he once knew her mother. How his voice carried the strange familiarity of someone she couldn't place. And how, one evening, that familiarity turned into a nightmare. When she showed me the photograph he had given her, my knees gave out. It was him. Older, thinner, but unmistakable. My father, he hadn't died. My mother's letter had been a lie. Maybe she had written it to protect me, to make me believe he was gone. But monsters rarely die when you need them to. They simply move to another shadow. I sat there in Grace's kitchen, shaking. The clock ticked loudly. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed. My daughter's voice faded into the background as memories overlapped his hand on my shoulder, the sound of the wooden chair, the smell of whiskey. History had found a way to repeat itself through my own child. "I didn't know who he was," she kept saying. "He told me his name was Henry, not Harold." I reached for her hands, both of us trembling. "He's taken everything from me once," I said. "He won't take anything from you." Grace cried harder. "What do we do, Mom?" I looked at her, at the fragile swell of her stomach, and I knew the answer before I could speak it. "We fight." For years, I survived by staying silent. This time, silence would not save anyone. The court building smelled of disinfectant and old wood. Light streamed through tall windows, white and harsh. Every sound echoed the shuffle of papers, the scrape of chairs, the low hum of whispered prayers. He sat across the room, older but not smaller. His hair was thin, his face wrinkled, but his eyes still carried that same hollow calm. He looked at me once, and for a moment, it was as if time folded in on itself. Grace sat beside me, her hand gripping mine so tightly that our knuckles turned white. She was 27, but in that moment, She looked like the little girl who used to hide behind my apron when thunder scared her. When they called her name, she stood. Her voice shook at first, but then grew stronger. She told them everything. The lies, the manipulation, the moment she realized who he was. The courtroom listened in absolute silence. Even the judge leaned forward. When she finished, she turned to me. Her eyes were full of tears, but also something new, defiance. I stood and walked to the front of the room. The air felt thick, like walking through water. "He destroyed me once," I said, my voice trembling. "And now he tried to destroy my daughter. But it ends here." The words echoed off the walls, cutting through the stillness. For the first time, I wasn't speaking to him. I was speaking to every woman who had ever been told to stay quiet. The judge nodded. The gavel fell. The sound of it was sharp and final, like the closing of a door. When we left the courthouse, the air outside felt cleaner. The sky was a pale blue, almost fragile. Grace leaned against me, her head on my shoulder. "Mom," she whispered, "do you think we'll ever be free?" I looked at her, at the life growing inside her, at the courage that had carried her through something I had never been able to name out loud for decades. "Yes," I said, "because you said his name. That's where freedom begins." We stood there until the wind picked up, carrying the scent of nearby bakeries, sugar, and apples and cinnamon. My scent, my peace, my life, rising again from the ashes of his. That night, I wrote in my journal, "It ends here. The silence, the fear, the shame. My daughter will not inherit my ghosts." The next morning, I baked again. The smell filled the house, sweet and warm, the same scent that had once kept me alive. Only this time, it wasn't a shield. It was a celebration. The past had echoed through generations, but for the first time, the sound faded into something else: freedom. The past had echoed through generations, but for the first time, the sound faded into something else: freedom. The trial ended on a gray November morning. The courtroom was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and waits there. When the verdict was read, I didn't cheer, I didn't cry. I simply closed my eyes and listened to the silence that followed, a silence unlike any I had known before. Harold Carter was sentenced to 15 years in prison, 15 years for a lifetime of damage. Part of me thought it wasn't enough. Another part of me didn't care. He would die alone, surrounded by walls instead of people to control. And when he did, there would be no obituary, no gravestone worth visiting, only an ending. When the guard led him away, he looked back at me once. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, were empty. I realized then that I no longer feared him. He was no longer the shadow in my dreams. He was just an old man walking into a darkness of his own making. Afterward, Grace and I stepped out of the courthouse hand in hand. The sky was pale and wide, the air crisp with the first hints of winter. I could feel the weight of the years lifting, not all at once, but enough to breathe again. She turned to me and whispered, "It's over." I shook my head gently. "No, it's beginning." Grace's pregnancy had been difficult. There were nights when she couldn't sleep, when the fear of what her child might inherit haunted her. But she carried on, day after day, surrounded by women who refused to let her face it alone. Neighbors, nurses, friends from the support group she joined after the trial. They built her a safety net of quiet strength. When the baby finally came, it was dawn. The hospital window glowed with that soft, forgiving light that only comes after long darkness. I stood beside her, holding her hand, whispering the same lullabies I had once sung to her when she was small. The doctor smiled and said, "It's a girl." Grace laughed through her tears. "Her name is Clara." I repeated it softly, tasting the word. "Clara." Grace smiled at me. "It means clarity after the storm." The nurse placed the baby in her arms, and for a long moment, everything else disappeared. The noise, the pain, the history. There was only the warmth of new life, the soft breath of a future unscarred. When I looked at Clara, I didn't see the shadow of my father. I saw sunlight. I saw redemption stitched into skin and heartbeat. For the first time in my life, the story of my family was no longer written in fear, but in survival. After Grace came home with Clara, the house filled with the sound of laughter again. James, older now but still steady as the mountains, held his granddaughter like a fragile miracle. "You're the sweetest thing I've ever seen," he whispered, his voice breaking in ways I'd never heard before. I reopened the bakery a month later. The sign still read Grace's Pies, But this time, I added a line underneath it, painted in white. And Clara's hope. Every morning, the smell of apple and cinnamon filled the air. Customers came not just for the pies, but to share their stories. Women told me about their own battles, about scars they had hidden for years. Men listened quietly, holding their wives' hands. The little shop became more than a bakery. It became a sanctuary, a place where brokenness didn't have to be hidden. Sometimes Grace brought Clara by after her hospital shifts. She would set the baby's carrier on the counter while she helped me knead dough. The smell of butter and sugar would wrap around us, and the rhythm of our hands would feel like prayer. Each time I looked at them, I thought of how far we had come from the dark kitchen in Nebraska to this warm room filled with laughter and flour dust. The wooden cradle that had once rocked Grace now held Clara. I had kept it all these years, and though it still creaked when it moved, the sound no longer frightened me. It was no longer a reminder of pain, but proof that something could survive it. Sometimes, healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means finding a way to live with what once tried to end you and turning it into something that feeds the world. On the evening of Clara's first birthday, we gathered behind the bakery. The air smelled of sugar and baked apples, the light soft and golden. James sat in a chair beside me, his hand resting gently over mine. Grace stood in the yard holding Clara, the little girl's tiny fingers tangled in her mother's hair. The sun dipped lower, and for a moment, the light caught all three of us, the past, the present, and the future, bound by blood, but no longer by fear. Clara reached out with her small hand, grabbing mine first, then Grace's. Her skin was warm, her grip surprisingly strong. In that moment, 3 generations stood together beneath the fading sun. The pain that had once silenced me now felt like a distant echo, replaced by something softer. Grace looked at me, tears shining in her eyes. "You did it, Mom," she said. "You broke it." I smiled. "No, sweetheart, we did." The light turned everything to gold. The air was filled with laughter and the faint hum of the bakery's ovens inside. For the first time, I felt something I had never dared to claim before: peace without conditions. I closed my eyes and whispered a quiet prayer for the women who were still living in silence, for the daughters and granddaughters who would one day find their voices too. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from so Evelyn's voice can reach even farther. Because every time a woman speaks her truth, the world becomes a little quieter for those who still can't, and a little brighter for those who will. Because every time a woman speaks her truth, the world becomes a little quieter for those who still can't, and a little brighter for those who will. Years have passed since that golden evening behind the bakery. Grace's hair now carries silver threads like mine once did. Clara, her daughter, runs the shop most mornings while I sit by the front window with my cup of tea. The sign outside now reads Grace and Clara's Bakery. The paint faded slightly from the years of rain and sunlight. People still come in for the pies, but most stay for the warmth that lingers longer than the taste of cinnamon. I am 80 now. My hands tremble when I roll the dough, but the smell of apples and butter still feels like home. Every morning, light spills through the glass, soft and golden, painting the walls with quiet kindness. The hum of the ovens, the laughter of customers, the clinking of cups, it all weaves together into a kind of music that feels like a heartbeat. Sometimes, when the morning rush has passed and the shop grows still, I look out the window and watch the world waking up. The school buses rumble by. A boy on a bicycle stops to tie his shoelace. The same woman in the blue coat comes every Thursday for her cherry pie. Life continues, unremarkable, yet beautiful in its steadiness. It is in that stillness that I finally understand something I never could when I was younger. Pain doesn't end with silence. It ends when you tell your story. Clara says people come here because the bakery feels alive. She says the walls remember things, the laughter, the tears, the moments when people thought they couldn't go on but somehow did. I like that idea, that even in the quiet, something listens. On most mornings, I sit by the same window where the sun lands first. The glass fogs slightly from the heat of the ovens behind me. I sip my tea, breathe in the scent of cinnamon, and let memory settle beside me like an old friend. Sometimes Clara joins me, her hands still dusted with flour, her face flushed from the kitchen. She'll say, "Grandma, tell me again about the day you opened the first bakery." And I'll laugh, not because it's funny, but because it still feels like a miracle. I tell her about how scared I was, how I didn't believe I could start over, how every pie I baked in those early days was a promise to myself that life could still taste sweet. Clara always listens quietly, eyes wide, heart open. I see in her what I once wished for, the proof that love can survive the ruins of what tried to break it. The morning light dances across the counter, catching in the steam of the fresh bread. For a brief moment, I imagine all the women who came before me, my mother, my daughter, myself, standing in that same light, not broken, just seen. Maybe healing is simply the act of sitting in the light long enough for it to recognize you back. Every person who walks into this bakery leaves a piece of their story behind. Some write it in the guest book near the register, others tell it in fragments while waiting for coffee. I read their words sometimes after closing. There are messages about love, forgiveness, loss, and starting over. One entry says, "This pie tastes like my grandmother's kitchen. I thought I'd forgotten that smell." Another reads, "I told my daughter the truth today. It didn't break us. It made us stronger." I keep their notes in a small box behind the counter. On hard days, when my hands ache and the past feels closer than I'd like, I open that box and read them one by one. They remind me why I told my story in the first place. People think telling the truth is about courage, but it isn't. It's about survival. Every word spoken out loud is one less weight carried alone. One afternoon, a young woman came in with her daughter. She hesitated at the door before ordering a slice of apple pie. When she tasted it, she started to cry. I walked over, placed my hand on hers and said, "It's all right, sweetheart, you're safe here." She nodded, wiped her tears, and whispered, "It smells like forgiveness." That night, I wrote those words down in my journal. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it lets it rest. When you stop hiding your story, you stop being haunted by it. The older I get, the more I realize that time doesn't heal everything. It simply gives you space to understand what broke and why. The cracks never disappear, but light finds its way through them. The bakery is quieter now in the evenings. The last customers leave, the chairs are stacked, and the smell of sugar lingers in the air. I sit at my usual table by the window, the one with the chipped corner, and open the guest book to the final page. My handwriting isn't what it used to be, but I steady my hand and write the words that have been waiting in me for a lifetime. Your past explains you, but it doesn't define you. I close the book and look out the window. Outside, the sky is blushing pink and gold. The streetlights begin to flicker on, one by one. Across the street, I see a mother and daughter walking hand in hand. The little girl laughs, her voice bright against the quiet evening. I lift my teacup and breathe in the last traces of warmth. The scent of baked apples and cinnamon fills the air again, soft and familiar. As the piano music plays gently from the radio, the screen of memory fades like sunlight on flour-dusted glass. I think of every woman who ever lived in silence, every story still waiting to be told, and I whisper into the golden light, "You are seen." For every woman who ever lived in silence, you are seen. Because sometimes the most powerful sound in the world is the voice that finally says, "This is my story." And so, through flour, fire, and forgiveness, Evelyn Carter's story found its peace not because the pain vanished, but because she dared to name it. The scent of apple and cinnamon became more than a memory. It became a prayer, whispered through generations, a promise that silence would no longer define them. In the end, Evelyn left behind more than a bakery. She left a truth that still lingers in the air like the warmth of bread at dawn. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to live where the light can reach you. If this story touched your heart, tell us yours. Share your voice in the comments. Let someone know they're not alone. Like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Grandma's Final Chapter so you won't miss the next story that might just mirror your own. Because every life has a final chapter, and sometimes it's only the beginning. In our next story, a widow discovers her late husband's secret letters and learns love doesn't always die with the body.